In 1930, a small boat pulled away from the rocky shore of Hirta, carrying the last 36 people who would ever call St Kilda home. The women were crying, the men stared straight ahead. Behind them, the most remote inhabited island in the British Isles grew smaller and smaller until it vanished into the Atlantic fog. They left behind their homes, their church, their ancestors buried in the hillside, and a way of life that had survived for over 4,000 years. Nobody ever moved back. Today, St Kilda sits 110 miles off the Scottish mainland, a cluster of sea stacks and volcanic islands where 1 million seabirds scream into the wind and the waves crash 200 feet up the highest sea cliffs in Britain. UNESCO gave it dual World Heritage status, one of only 24 places on Earth to hold that distinction. The British military maintains a small radar station. Scientists visit in summer, but no one lives there. Not really, not the way people once did. This is the story of the most isolated community Britain ever produced, how they survived for millennia on the edge of the known world, and why, in the end, the modern world killed them faster than any storm ever could. If you find this fascinating, hit subscribe right now. We cover forgotten places and impossible ways of living every single week. And the next video is one you will not want to miss. Before we get into what life actually looked like on St Kilda, you need to understand where this place sits on the map, because the geography explains everything. Chapter 1. The Edge of the World. St Kilda is not one island. It is an archipelago, a small cluster of islands and sea stacks roughly 40 miles west of the Outer Hebrides, which themselves are already off the west coast of Scotland. To reach St Kilda from the Scottish mainland, you must cross 110 miles of some of the most violent ocean in the North Atlantic. The main island, Hirta, is the only one that was ever permanently inhabited. It measures less than 2.5 square miles. The highest point, Connacher, rises to 1,410 feet, making it the highest sea cliff in all of Britain. Stand on the edge and look down, and you will see nothing but vertical rock falling into white foam. The wind at the top can reach 130 miles per hour in winter storms. To the northwest sits Boré, a smaller island so steep that landing on it requires calm seas and extraordinary courage. Between Boré and Hirta rise Stack Lee and Stack and Armon, two enormous sea stacks, pillars of rock jutting from the ocean like the broken teeth of some ancient god. Stack and Armon reaches 644 feet, the tallest sea stack in all of Britain. The climate is brutal. Rainfall averages 50 inches per year. Gale force winds blow on average 1 day out of every 3. Fog can descend for weeks. The growing season is short, the soil is thin, and the nearest tree is over 100 miles away. There are no trees on St Kilda. There never were. The wind will not allow it. And yet, for 4,000 years, people lived here. Archaeological evidence shows human presence on St Kilda, dating back to the Bronze Age, around 2,000 years before Christ. By the medieval period, a small but stable community had established itself in Village Bay on Hirta, a crescent-shaped settlement tucked into the one sheltered spot on the entire island, facing southeast away from the prevailing Atlantic gales. At its peak, the population never exceeded 180 people. For most of recorded history, it hovered between 70 and 100. These were people who had almost no contact with the outside world for months at a time. The sea crossing was too dangerous for regular visits. Mailboats came perhaps 3 or 4 times a year when the weather allowed. In winter, St Kilda was completely cut off. So, how did they survive? The answer is one of the strangest economies in British history. Chapter 2. The Birdmen of Hirta. On St Kilda, wealth was not measured in money. It was measured in birds. The islands sit at the intersection of several major Atlantic seabird migration routes. Every spring, over 1 million birds descend on the cliffs and stacks of the archipelago. Gannets, fulmars, puffins, and petrels nest in enormous colonies on every available ledge, crack, and grassy slope. The gannet colony on Borare and its stacks is the largest in the world, numbering over 60,000 breeding pairs. For the people of St Kilda, these birds were everything: food, fuel, medicine, rent, trade goods, clothing material. The entire economy of the island revolved around harvesting seabirds and their eggs. Every year, the men of St Kilda would scale the cliffs barefoot. They used horsehair ropes, some over 100 feet long, tied around their waists while a partner anchored at the top. They climbed down vertical and overhanging rock faces that would terrify modern rock climbers with full equipment. They did this without harnesses, without helmets, without any safety gear whatsoever. The most skilled climbers could descend the face of Conachare in minutes, snatching fulmars from their nests mid-climb. Boys as young as 8 or 9 began training on lower cliffs. By adulthood, a St Kildan man was expected to be able to traverse any cliff on the island blindfolded in fog. A young man could not marry until he had proven himself on the rocks. The test was specific and terrifying. He had to stand on the edge of a cliff called the Mistress Stone, balanced on one foot with his heel over the void, and reach down to grasp his other foot. Only then was he considered worthy of supporting a family. Visitors who witnessed the climbing were astonished. In 1860, a journalist from the mainland described watching a man walk along a ledge 400 feet above the sea, no wider than his foot, carrying a bundle of dead fulmars slung over his shoulder, whistling as though he was strolling down a country lane. A misstep meant death. Deaths did happen, roughly one every few years. It was considered an acceptable cost. The annual harvest was enormous. Records from the 1870s show the community taking approximately 12,000 fulmars, 3,000 gannets, and thousands of puffins each year. The birds were plucked, split open, and dried or smoked. Fulmar oil was stored in the stomachs of dried gannets, creating a sealed container. Feathers were collected and stored for export. Every part of the bird was used. Puffins were caught using a different method. The women and children would sit at puffin burrows with a long horsehair snare on the end of a rod, slipping the loop over the bird's head as it emerged. An experienced woman could catch 300 puffins in a single day. The dried birds were stored in small stone structures called clates, perhaps the most distinctive feature of the St Kildan landscape. Over 1,400 clates are scattered across Hirta and the surrounding islands. Small dry stone chambers with turf roofs, designed so that the wind could pass through the gaps in the stones, creating a natural ventilation system that preserved the bird meat without salt, which was almost impossible to obtain on the island. These cleats were everywhere: behind the houses, on the hillsides, along the cliff tops, even on the sea stacks. The community stored everything in them: dried birds, eggs, turf, ropes, tools. They are still standing today, over 1,000 of them, dotting the landscape like ancient stone hives. Chapter 3. The Parliament of St Kilda. Every morning, the men of St Kilda gathered in the main street of the village. They stood in a rough circle, sometimes leaning against the walls of their houses, sometimes crouching on the stone dike. This was the St Kilda Parliament. It was not a formal institution. There was no elected leader, no written constitution, no voting system. It was simply a daily meeting where the men decided what work needed to be done that day. Should they climb the cliffs? Should they tend the sheep? Should they repair a boat? Should they cut peat? The discussion could last for hours. Every man had an equal voice. Decisions were reached by consensus, not majority vote. If one man disagreed strongly, the discussion continued until agreement was found or the plan was modified. Visitors from the mainland were often frustrated by the length of these meetings, describing the St Kildans as argumentative and indecisive. The St Kildans themselves saw it differently. No man would be forced to do work he had not agreed to. Women did not attend the parliament, but this did not mean they were powerless. Women controlled the domestic economy entirely. They managed the distribution of food stores, decided when cleats would be opened, organized the milking of sheep, and handled the processing of tweed and feathers for export. Several accounts from the 19th century describe visiting factors being directed to speak with specific women about trade goods, not men. The community operated without money for most of its history. Rent was paid to the MacLeod clan chief in kind: dried birds, feathers, oil, tweed. Internal exchange was based on need and reciprocity. If a family had surplus fulmar oil, it went to a family that did not. If a man was injured and could not climb, others climbed for him. There was no concept of individual profit. This system worked for centuries. It worked because it had to. On an island where one bad season could mean starvation, cooperation was not a virtue. It was survival. Chapter 4. What they ate, what they wore, what they believed. The diet of St Kilda was unlike anything else in Britain. Seabirds formed the foundation, supplemented by eggs, sheep products, a small amount of barley and potatoes, and whatever fish could be caught from the rocks. Fresh fish was surprisingly scarce in the diet because the St Kildans had no harbour, and their boats were small and fragile in the Atlantic swells. A typical meal might consist of boiled fulmar with potatoes or gannet broth thickened with barley. Puffin was considered less desirable and was often food for children or the elderly. The taste of fulmar apparently permeates everything it touches. Visitors frequently remarked that the entire island smelled of fulmar oil, that the houses smelled of it, that the people smelled of it, that you could taste it in the water. The eggs of seabirds were collected in vast quantities during nesting season. Guillemot eggs, each one the size of a man's fist and brilliantly speckled, were a particular delicacy. Men would rappel down cliff faces to collect them from narrow ledges, carrying them in a bag slung around their necks. Sheep provided wool for tweed, which became the primary export and trade good by the 19th century. The St Kildan sheep, known as Soay sheep, are a primitive breed with brown fleece that they shed naturally. The women spun the wool and wove it into a distinctive rough tweed that mainland merchants would buy. Clothing was simple. Men wore homespun tweed trousers and jackets. Women wore long skirts and shawls. Everyone went barefoot much of the time, even on the rocks, even in cold weather. The children went barefoot year-round. Shoes were precious items reserved for church on Sundays. Religion dominated life on St Kilda from the mid-19th century onward. When the Free Church of Scotland sent a resident minister to the island in the 1860s, the transformation was dramatic. The Reverend John Mackay, who arrived in 1865, imposed a strict Presbyterian discipline that consumed much of the community's time. Services were held multiple times on Sundays and often during the week. Work on the Sabbath was absolutely forbidden, regardless of weather conditions or urgent need. Several historians have argued that the influence of organized religion actually accelerated St Kilda's decline by reducing the time available for essential survival work. When a supply ship arrived on a Sunday, its cargo could not be unloaded until Monday, even if it contained medicine or food desperately needed. Chapter 5. The tourists who came to stare. Starting in the 1870s, something new arrived on St Kilda: tourists. Steamship companies began offering summer cruises to the island, advertising it as a glimpse of primitive life, a living museum of how ancient Britons once lived. Ships would anchor in Village Bay, and passengers would come ashore in small boats to gawk at the islanders. The effect was profound and destructive. Tourists brought money, which disrupted the gift economy that had sustained the community for centuries. They brought goods, creating dependencies on items that could not be produced locally. They brought diseases, particularly influenza and smallpox, against which the isolated community had no immunity. A devastating pattern emerged that the St Kildans called the boat cold. Within days of any ship arriving, the entire population would fall ill with respiratory infections. Babies were particularly vulnerable. In some years, the infant mortality rate reached 80%. 8 out of every 10 babies born on St Kilda died within their first 2 weeks of life, from what was later identified as neonatal tetanus, likely caused by the traditional practice of dressing the umbilical cord with fulmar oil. The tourists also brought something less tangible, but equally damaging: the knowledge of how the rest of the world lived. Young St Kildans, who had never questioned their existence, suddenly saw what life looked like, with proper housing, varied food, medical care, education, and opportunity. The psychological effect was corrosive. By the early 1900s, the young were leaving. Anyone who could arrange passage to the mainland did so. The population, already small, began to collapse. By 1920, fewer than 40 people remained. Most were elderly. There were not enough able-bodied men to crew the boats or climb the cliffs safely. Chapter 6. The Letters in Bottles. One of the most poignant details of St Kilda's isolation is the mailboat system. When seas were too rough for any vessel to approach the island, which could last for months in winter, the St Kildans had only one way to communicate with the outside world. They would take a piece of driftwood or a hollowed sheep's bladder, attach a letter inside, seal it as best they could, and throw it into the sea. The prevailing currents carried these makeshift mailboats eastward toward the Scottish mainland or the Outer Hebrides. Some arrived within days, others took weeks or months. Many were never found at all. The success rate was estimated at roughly 2/3. Not bad for a message in a bottle tossed into the North Atlantic. The system was used for everything from requests for supplies to emergency calls for help. In 1876, when a food shortage threatened the community, a mailboat message reached the mainland and prompted a relief ship to be sent. The journalist John Sands, visiting in 1877, helped the community send a more formal distress signal by attaching a message to a small wooden boat carved from driftwood and fitted with a tiny mast and sail. It reached the coast of Orkney 9 days later. The story made national newspapers, briefly turning St Kilda into a cause célèbre. But brief attention from the mainland press did little to address the fundamental problem. St Kilda was dying slowly, and everyone on the island knew it. Chapter 7. The Evacuation of 1930. By 1928, the situation on St Kilda had become critical. The population had fallen to 36. Several of the remaining residents were elderly and ill. There was no nurse on the island, and no means of getting emergency medical care. In January of 1930, a young woman named Mary Gillies fell ill with appendicitis. The community managed to signal a passing trawler, which relayed a message to the mainland. A naval vessel was dispatched, but by the time it arrived, Mary had been suffering for days. She was evacuated and survived, but the incident crystallized what everyone already knew. Staying on St Kilda was no longer sustainable. In the spring of 1930, the remaining residents composed a letter to the British government. It read, in part, "We, the undersigned, the natives of St Kilda, hereby respectfully pray and petition His Majesty's government to assist us all to leave the island this year and find homes and employment on the mainland." Every adult on the island signed. On the 29th of August, 1930, HMS Harebell anchored in Village Bay. The 36 remaining inhabitants loaded their belongings into small boats and were ferried to the ship. Each family was allowed to bring only what they could carry. Their furniture, their looms, their tools, most of their possessions were left behind. The last act before leaving was grim. Each household left an open Bible on their table and a small pile of oats for the mice. It was a tradition whose origin no one could explain, but everyone observed it. As the ship pulled away, several of the older women wept openly. The men reportedly sat in silence below decks. The dogs had been left behind. They were later retrieved, but the sheep were left to go feral. Their descendants still roam Hirta today, a primitive breed now studied by geneticists. The evacuees were resettled across the Scottish mainland, primarily in Morven and around Inverness. The adjustment was brutal. People who had spent their entire lives in a community of 36 were suddenly in towns of thousands. Men who had climbed sea cliffs since childhood were given jobs in forestry. Women who had managed an entire island's food supply were placed in domestic service. Several of the older evacuees died within a few years. They simply could not adapt. One man reportedly said he felt like a prisoner. The walls of his new house closed in on him. He missed the wind. Chapter 8. What remains today? 80 years after the evacuation, St Kilda exists in a strange, liminal state. It belongs to the National Trust for Scotland. It holds UNESCO World Heritage status for both its natural environment and its cultural significance. The British Ministry of Defence operates a small radar tracking station on Hirta, staffed by civilian contractors who rotate in and out. In summer, work parties of volunteers travel to the island to maintain the village buildings. The stone cottages along the main street have been partially restored, their roofs replaced, their walls stabilized. The church still stands. The schoolhouse still stands. The factor's house, where the landlord's representative once stayed, has been converted into a small museum, but nobody lives there permanently. The military contractors stay for months at a time, but they are not residents in any meaningful sense. They are stationed there. When their rotation ends, they leave. No one is born on St Kilda. No one will grow old there again. Walk through Village Bay on a calm summer day, and the silence is extraordinary. The only sounds are wind, seabirds, and the distant crash of waves on the western cliffs. The clates still stand in their hundreds, scattered across the hillside like a ruined city in miniature. The head dike, the stone wall that once separated the cultivated land from the open hill, still traces its line across the landscape. The Soay sheep still graze the slopes, completely wild now, studied each year by scientists who use them as a model for understanding population dynamics in isolated ecosystems. The sheep population booms and crashes in cycles, reaching over 2,000 before collapsing in harsh winters back to 600 or 700. On Boré, the sheep are even more primitive. A separate breed called Boré sheep, descended from the blackface flock, kept there before the evacuation. They have had no human contact whatsoever since 1930. They are among the most isolated domestic animals on Earth. Chapter 9. Why no one ever went back? This is the question that haunts the story. If St Kilda is so extraordinary, so beautiful, so significant, why has no one ever returned to live there permanently? The answer is both simple and complex. The simple version: modern people do not need to live on St Kilda. There is no economic reason to be there. The birds are protected now, not harvested. The land cannot support agriculture at any viable scale. The weather makes permanent settlement miserable for 8 months of the year. The nearest hospital is hours away by boat in good conditions, days in bad. The complex version has more layers. St Kilda represents something that modernity cannot accommodate, a community that exists purely for its own sake, without economic justification, without growth potential, without connectivity to the broader system. In the modern world, every settlement must justify its existence in economic terms. St Kilda cannot. There is also the psychological dimension. The evacuees themselves, when interviewed in later years, were divided. Some expressed deep regret and longing. Others said they were glad to have left, that life on the island was grinding and limited. One woman, interviewed in 1970, said that people romanticize St Kilda because they never had to live there in February. Perhaps the most honest answer is that St Kilda worked only as a complete system. The birds, the cliffs, the communal economy, the daily parliament, the shared purpose, the absolute interdependence. Remove any single element and the whole thing collapses. You cannot recreate that system with modern individuals who have other options. The magic of St Kilda was not the place, it was the necessity. Chapter 10. The cost of living at the edge. So what does St Kilda teach us about the cost of living? Not cost in pounds and pence, but cost in the truest sense. What must you give up to live a life of radical simplicity? The St Kildans paid in isolation. Months without news, without medicine, without any contact with the outside world. They paid in infant mortality, losing most of their babies to diseases that were easily preventable elsewhere. They paid in physical danger, with men dying on the cliffs every few years. They paid in monotony, eating the same foods, seeing the same faces, walking the same paths for their entire lives. But they also gained something that modern life has almost entirely lost. They had absolute community. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone depended on everyone. There was no loneliness on St Kilda because there was no privacy, and there was no abandonment because there was no option to leave. They had purpose every single day. The work was hard, but it was clear. Climb, harvest, store, survive, repeat. They had no debt, no rent in the modern sense, no utility bills, no commute, no career anxiety. Their mental health challenges, though real, did not include the particular modern sickness of meaninglessness. Every action they took was directly connected to survival. There was no abstraction between effort and result. Today, people spend thousands of pounds per month to live in cities where they know no one, commute to jobs that feel pointless, and scroll through images of places they will never visit. The St Kildans had none of that luxury and none of that misery. Their poverty was absolute, and so was their belonging. This is not to romanticize. Life on St Kilda was brutally hard. The infant mortality alone makes any nostalgia obscene. But the question St Kilda poses to us, sitting in our heated apartments with our unlimited choices, is this: what exactly are we paying for? And is it worth it? Chapter 11. Visiting St Kilda today. If you want to see St Kilda with your own eyes, it is possible, but not easy and not cheap. Several companies operate boat trips from Harris and Uist in the Outer Hebrides. The crossing takes between 3 and 5 hours, depending on conditions, and roughly 1/3 of scheduled trips are cancelled due to weather. Even in summer, the Atlantic, between the Hebrides and St Kilda, can be savage. Seasickness is almost guaranteed for those not accustomed to open ocean. Day trips allow roughly 4 to 5 hours on the island. You land at Village Bay by inflatable boat, assuming the swell permits it. Some years, boats circle the island unable to land at all. The cost ranges from £150 to £300 per person, depending on the operator and departure point. For those with more time and money, the National Trust for Scotland runs volunteer work parties between May and August. You stay on the island for 2 weeks, helping maintain the buildings, recording archaeological finds, counting seabirds. Accommodation is basic. Bunk beds in the old military buildings. You pay for the privilege, several £100s, plus your travel to the Outer Hebrides. There are no facilities for independent visitors. No hotel, no shop, no restaurant, no campsite. You bring everything with you and you take everything away. Mobile phone signal is intermittent at best. The military base has a small canteen, but it is not open to visitors. What you will see is this: a village frozen in time. Stone houses with hollow eyes staring out at the bay. Over 1,000 clates scattered across an impossible green hillside. Sea cliffs dropping into blue oblivion. Puffins by the thousand, so unafraid of humans they will land on your boots. the largest gannet colony on Earth, visible as a white blanket on the distant cliffs of Boré, and silence. Vast, thick, Atlantic silence, broken only by the wind and the birds. Many people who visit say it changed something in them. Not in a dramatic way, just a quiet rearrangement of priorities. A reminder that everything we think we need, we invented the need for. The St Kildans needed the cliffs, the birds, and each other. That was enough for 4,000 years. It was not enough for the 20th century. But looking at how the 20th century turned out, perhaps we should ask whether the 20th century was enough for them. The last surviving evacuee, Rachel Johnson, died in 1916 at the age of 93. She had left St Kilda as a young woman and lived the rest of her life on the mainland. But neighbors said she never stopped talking about the island. In her final years, she told a journalist that she still dreamed of Village Bay most nights. The sound of the gannets, the smell of peat smoke, the feeling of wet grass under bare feet at dawn. She said the mainland never felt like home, not once in 60 years. This is St Kilda, the island Britain abandoned and never came back to. A place where the cost of living was everything you had, and the reward was a life so complete that its absence still echoes across an empty ocean, 95 years after the last boat pulled away. If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe. Next week, we are visiting another place the modern world forgot, one that makes St Kilda look cosmopolitan. I will see you there.